This is the Comics Alternative, episode 235. Reviews of Styx Angelica, Folk Hero, and DC's Hanna-Barbera specials. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to look at several recent titles. We're going to begin with the new book by Michael DeForge, Styx Angelica, Folk Hero, published by Drawn & Quarterly. And after that, we're going to look at the 4 recent Hanna-Barbera annuals from DC Comics. But before we get into that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but many times you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, and since we're talking about Michael DeForge's Styx Angelica Folk Hero, you can go on the DCB service right now and find it for 30% off. So if you like what you hear in our review today, you can check that out.
That's right. You can find all sorts of discounts, great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. You must go to their website, dcbservice.com, because they will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
So, Andy, I know that we're securely into the month of April, and this is kind of a busy time for both of us. We're getting toward the end of the semester, but at least we're taking some time out to read some good comics for this week.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff on our plate for this episode.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and get to that plate.
Yep.
We're going to begin with the new book from Michael DeForge, Styx Angelica, Folk Hero. This came out in March from Drawn & Quarterly, and we strongly recommend that you get this book. It's an interesting story, but if you're strapped for cash, I guess you could check out the webcomic, because Styx Angelica, Folk Hero originally began as Michael DeForge's webcomic on Tumblr. So if you go to styxangelica.tumblr.com, you'll be able to see it. And from what I've seen, DeForge has left everything up there. He hasn't truncated it in any way. It's just that your reading experience may be a little different than ours was. And this was originally put up between May and December of 2015. But Drawn & Quarterly just published a book version of this last month.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that it's pretty recent is another indication of something we've talked about whenever we bring up Michael DeForge, which is how prolific he is.
Oh, right. I mean, this guy's all over the place. It seems like he has at least a book a year coming out from Drawn & Quarterly. I think last year was Big Kids, which is, I guess, by Michael DeForge standards, a fairly conventional narrative compared to some of the other stuff he does. But then he has his series Loose from Koyama Press, and he does the occasional short comics here or there. I know last year he came out with a really nice mini comic from the Latvian publisher Kush. This one is called Meat Locker. It is short strips about gyms, trainers, and meatheads.
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is a kind of general comment. I think also that I've made before is that I really hope that a lot of the shorter stuff ends up getting collected, because I don't feel like there's anything yet of DeForge's that I feel like I could teach.
Mm-hmm.
And but except that I think I could do that with the shorter works. I would just like one big chunk of those.
Right. Have you considered the stories in Very Casual that came out a few years ago from Koyama?
Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Yeah. And then maybe an issue of Lose. But it would be nice if maybe a longer work of his were more teachable. I don't know if you've checked out Big Kids.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, that may be, as I mentioned, it's a little more conventional in a way than some of his other stuff. But I've never taught DeForge. It would be an interesting experience to do so, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think Styx Angelica, Folk Hero, stands up to his other work that we know?
I think that it's interesting that you mentioned Big Kids being a more conventional narrative than his other works. Mm-hmm. Because I felt like Styx of the stuff of his that I've read, and I have not read nearly everything, I found Styx Angelica to be the closest to a conventional work of his that I've read, and it's not even close to being conventional.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And so it is interesting that two of his more recent works are probably going to be more accessible to general comics readers than the earlier works of his, as good as those are. It's just different kinds of storytelling, many times very abstract. I mean, you're still dealing in a somewhat traditional sense with character and character development to some degree, but the kind of characters that he writes about are going to be a little off-putting, or at least throw some readers off kilter.
Right. And even though in Styx Angelica you do get a couple of real life creators featured in the book, Michael DeForge himself shows up, as does Lisa Hanawalt. I don't know Lisa Hanawalt at all. I've never talked to her or met her, but I assume that she's not an upright walking moose.
And a law moose at that.
A law moose, yeah. and Michael DeForge, I don't think, is a head on a completely flimsy body that flies around on the wind. Yeah,
the body being flimsy, floaty, after being buried in the ground for a couple of seasons.
Yes.
Yeah, and if it sounds, dear listener, like a weird story after Andy and I were saying that it's somewhat conventional, well, it is a weird story. And so the main character, the title character, is a young woman. I think she's in her 30s, right?
No, she's 49.
Oh, this 49. Oh, she's 49.
Yeah, that's what it says in the very first strip.
Oh, okay.
So Angelica, 49-year-old. Yeah, and it gives her credits, her CV.
Oh, okay. Yeah, former Olympian, poet, scholar, sculptor, minister, activist, governor general, entrepreneur, line cook, headmistress, Mountie, columnist, libertarian, cellist. Okay, so so she's a 49-year-old woman, and she's living in Monterey County Park in Canada. And in fact, I even looked up Monterey County in Canada to see if there was an actual Monterey County. And I don't know if there is or not, because in all of my searches, I kept coming up with nothing but California references.
Yeah.
But anyway, so she lives away from, I guess you could say, civilization, or at least her family. And we learned at one point, went off to the park to live, to get away from her father, who was a politician, and there's some strange scandal that was going on there. She just wanted to be rid of all that. But then there are other characters in this story that populate her world. For instance, there is a rabbit by the name of Oatmeal who is enamored of Styx. But Styx doesn't return the affection, at least overtly. But yet Oatmeal has someone who's enamored with him. It's an eel.
Right.
But Oatmeal doesn't pay attention to the eel. Other characters include a bear, there are some geese that are really stupid. They're called the dumb geese. There's a girl called Girl McNally, who becomes I guess a major character in this book. And then, of course, there's the aforementioned Michael DeForge, who plays this kind of reporter journalist type character, not a cartoonist as far as we know. And then there's Lisa Hanawalt, which is not human at all. It's a moose who, when we first meet the moose, is wearing Styx Angelica's sweaters and wants to be like Styx Angelica because she's so admirable. But then she goes off to get a life of her own, and she goes off to the city, takes a law degree, and becomes Lisa Hanawalt Law Moose.
Yeah.
And, you know, this was a weekly strip on Tumblr, and it does have that weekly strip feel to it. And in fact, when I first read Styx Angelica, I didn't know that it was originally a webcomic. And I was reading through the book, and I thought, is he intentionally going for the, you know, weekly comic strip feel, or was this actually a webcomic that it reads like it does because it was a webcomic? And it was the latter.
Yeah, I'm glad that you checked that out, and because I read this on a PDF, and so I was wondering just, you know, what it looked like. I could tell that it was that each page was set up as an individual 2-tiered strip, but I wasn't sure what the format of the book is. So is it formatted like say, you know, one of the like comic strip volumes that we get from the Library of America, a Library of American Comics that has like it's shorter than it is long?
Yes, exactly. So it does have those dimensions to it. So every page is basically one of the strips, and you're right. For the most part, those are, 2-tiered strip with each installment. Although there are some strips that are just one panel or maybe even a couple of panels long. But the book has that dimension to the point that because I've got a hard copy, when I was reading it, I found holding the book not uncomfortable and not really annoying. It's just not the best if you want to just hold something with one hand.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, it definitely does make you aware of the fact that you're holding a physical object in your hand as you're reading this. And I think it would be maybe a little more comfortable to lay this out on a table and read it that way.
Mm-hmm. I feel that way about a lot of the Library of American Comics volumes anyway, that are, or any book that's in that format, that if I try to read it lying down or reading it, you know, holding it with one hand and I don't know, eating jelly beans with the other hand, that it puts stress on the spine of the book so that the end pages start to tear.
Yeah, but there's not enough here in Styx Angelica to where the weight is going to do much of anything to the spine. So in that way, I don't think there's any damage that you're going to bring to the book inadvertently. It's just the length of it is a little awkward. Mm-hmm. But still, and I'm wondering about, you know, the experience of my reading versus yours, because you were looking at the PDF, and then both of those versus the original webcomic version.
Right. But it is it does. So it came out weekly when it was a webcomic. Yeah,
or it says on the Tumblr site a weekly webcomic. So I'm assuming that DeForge more or less stayed to that weekly status. You know, it's also interesting about the reading experience and what you take away from Styx Angelica, given something that Sean and I were discussing just recently on this month's webcomic show, because there were a couple of webcomics we discussed, one of which was a quite famous webcomic, Menage 3. And the way that both Sean and I read this was within a relatively constrained time period, because even though both of us had heard of Menage 3 before, we had never read it even semi-regularly before we prepared for this month's webcomic episode. And neither of us really enjoyed. I mean, we enjoyed the comic enough, but we didn't get out of it what I think a lot of readers do who keep up with it, for the reason that we were reading this within a relatively short time frame. But I think people who had been with the comic, even from let's say the very beginning, who were reading it, say 2 or 3 times a week when it comes out, that story unfolding over a longer period was maybe a better reading experience, and you got to know the characters, the situations a little better, and things didn't seem as contrived. But when you sit down and read everything all at once, the contrivedness of the story seems to come out in places. So I'm wondering about the reading experience of Styx Angelica as a webcomic versus reading it, let's say, in one sitting, as you and I did.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it doesn't. I mean, it's if Styx Angelica has an overarching narrative, it's that, is Styx going to leave the forest and return to civilization? Right. It's kind of the big story here, and then there's smaller stories as well. I mean, you mentioned the one. There's was it Girl McNally?
Yeah,
that she has her own kind of mini narrative. They're smaller like that, multi-part stories, but I feel like that it comes closer to being something like a gag strip.
Yeah,
with a larger with some kind of larger kind of vague arcs about it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are developments, both characters and also situations, that are sprinkled in at one point that are carried through in later strips. And we see that clearly with the aforementioned Girl McNally, because at one point, this is one of the first few strips of the book, Styx is observing animals in the forest, and some of them have an X on them, and the way that it's described is they're marked, right? So these animals have done something wrong in the world. Maybe they pissed off another animal, or they stole something, or they used foul language, or just something to where a tribunal of forest creatures agree that, okay, they're okay to hunt if you want to kill those guys. And so you're only able to kill those animals with marks on them. And so at one point when Styx is looking off into the forest, she notices this human girl running across at a distance the forest floor, and she has an X on her. So it's a young girl with no shirt with an X on her chest. And she wonders about who and what that was, and we as readers wonder about it. But if I remember correctly, Girl McNally is not in the next 1 or 2 strips, but we do see her a little later. And so what DeForge does is he teases, brings out a little more, but then the further we get into the book, starts playing out the Girl McNally story on a regular basis for a while.
Right.
And then there are other characters who have the same thing going on. Like, for instance, the Michael DeForge character.
Yeah, that's right. Who's working, right, to be the great reporter for this forest, but meanwhile the bear is also competing for that position as well.
Yeah. In fact, one story involving Michael DeForge, reporter, is after he leaves the ground and he has this wispy body and he's carried off, and he ends up landing in a place in the forest where it is all a jumble. His legs look like they're broken, and animals gather around him. And this bear that you had mentioned comes up to him. And, the animals are talking to Michael DeForge, and the bear steps on his head, and one of the geese there asks, "What are you doing?" The bear said, "Putting him out of his misery." It doesn't kill Michael DeForge, but what it does is it lands him in the hospital. And so the next strip we see Styx Angelica visiting Michael DeForge in the hospital, but then she has to go off and do other things. And so what she does is brings in a proxy Styx Angelica, which is a bunch of ants. Makes no sense, but that's okay. This is Michael DeForge.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a lot of it. In fact, the whole plot, I guess, involving Michael DeForge is one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah.
From the point in which Styx beats him so severely that she pounds him into the ground with just his head sticking out, and then the flies fly into his mouth and try to lift him out of the ground that way, which doesn't work. Right. There's there's a lot of really, really funny moments in this book that did make me laugh out loud. So I did really enjoy this.
Yeah, this is I don't know if we want to call this a deep book, but it's one that is very enjoyable, very funny. I don't know if I want to call it light, because I don't mean that in a negative way. But in other words, you're not going to be pondering many of life's mysteries while reading this, right? If anything, you're going to enjoy the experience of doing so without being asked to really think through a lot of larger thematic, philosophical, or even narrative issues.
Right. Though I think that there may be some themes related to like justice
and in ecology.
Yeah, in ecology.
Yeah,
and whether it's a good idea to let a mosquito live inside your ear.
That's what the geese does.
As one of the geese does, yeah. But the kind of arbitrary nature of the justice of the forest tribunal, I think, is a common, I guess, theme in this book.
Yeah, and along with that, and this is where we can bring back the character of Lisa Hanawalt, Law Moose, in that she apparently becomes a lawyer, but then at another moment when Lisa Hanawalt is having a heart-to-heart with Styx Angelica, she confesses, well, I'm not really a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah. So, what does that say about, our law system, our legal system?
Well, the idea that a moose can dream to someday be a lawyer is, I think, I guess this would be the Canadian legal system. I don't know what the Canadian legal system is like. Maybe moose can be lawyers.
Yeah. And so Canada. Our Canadian listeners, get in touch with us and let us know, how accurate a document Styx Angelica is when it comes to your culture.
Though it's funny because when I was at CXC, I was talking to Brandon Graham, who's also Canadian, and the subject came up of a Canadian identity in comics, and we talked about stuff like that like Seth and Chester Brown and
Joe Matt,
yeah, but also Julie Doucet, all had they were clearly the stuff they were doing well. Julie moves to New York at one point, but their Canadian stuff is clearly taking place in Canada and has a Canadian sensibility. He didn't know if there was a real. He said something about kind of questioning the idea of that today, but I think Michael DeForge is definitely one of the creators, at least in this work, that has this. It's not just that it takes place in Canada, but there's a kind of Canadian sense of humor, I feel, to it. That's a very kind of easygoing narrative that's entertaining.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure if I can really put my finger on it other than knowing that it takes place in Canada.
Yeah.
But there is something that feels Canadian about this to me.
Joe Ullman is another creator that I would put into that group. And there are a lot of others. And you're right. There is this question that's worth discussing, maybe not necessarily on this show, but definitely when you are able to talk with Canadian creators is there such thing as a Canadian sensibility or can you put your finger on a Canadian comics artist? Because, I mean, it reminds me of questions that I've dealt with in the past when it comes to something like Jewish American literature, right? So, does the author have to write about Jewish subject matter, and how do you define that in order for it to be considered Jewish literature by a Jewish creator? And then questions of what is considered Jewish content is definitely up for grabs, and even a potentially offensive question to ask. But then also the question comes up: well, do you have to be Jewish to write Jewish literature or Jewish American literature in this case? And what do you do with someone like a John Updike who writes through the lens of a Jewish writer from the 20th century, like a Norman Mailer or Philip Roth or Saul Bellow, and touches on many of the defining features of Jewish comics. So if we're talking about Canadian comic creators, do they have to have a Canadian sensibility? How do you define that? Do they have to be Canadian to do so? I mean, what do you do with someone like a Joe Mad who he's not originally from Canada, is he?
Oh, no, he's from Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah. So, but he became associated with the Canadian comics culture for a while. So it raises interesting questions. But I think of the things I've read from Michael DeForge, this seems to be his most Canadian conscious work that I can recall.
Yeah.
Actually, Seth does make an appearance in this comic, or at least Seth's hat does.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. There's one strip called Notable Ontario Pastries, and one of them is called Seth's Hat, which appears to be a hat that looks nothing like a fedora with peanut butter in it.
Yeah, I noted that, but I'd forgotten to mention it.
Yeah, and so I'm waiting for a confectioner to come up with an actual Seth's Hat delicacy.
Sure, yeah. Well, it could be in what is the town that Seth lives?
I'm blanking on that. The one where his wife's barbershop is.
Right.
Yeah.
That he designed.
Yeah. Maybe they can
so I can imagine a bakery there that he would design too.
Yeah, and maybe they can have this at TCAF this year.
Yeah, good idea.
That's next month.
That's too soon.
Well, anything else about Styx Angelica, or you want to move on to the next cluster of titles we're going to be looking at?
I think we didn't. One of the things we didn't mention is the color scheme of Styx Angelica, because it is monochromatic, I guess.
Yeah, with a kind of a darker pink to it.
Yeah, and that runs throughout the book. I just wanted to make sure that again, that my PDF reflected what the original was.
Yes, and the original webcomic was that way as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So it bore the same colors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if we want to move on to this next series of titles that we're grouping under the Hanna-Barbera annuals from DC, these include 4 titles that just came out, I think just last week as we're recording this, correct? Or maybe the week before?
Yeah, I think so. I ordered them through DCB service, so I'm not sure when they all came out.
And these are titles that kind of cross over a DC hero or group with Hanna-Barbera characters. And so there's Adam Strange and Future Quest, there's Suicide Squad and the Banana Splits, Green Lantern and Space Ghost, and then Booster Gold and the Flintstones. And another notable thing about each of these issues is each has a backup strip from different creators on different Hanna-Barbera properties, and so not the kind of stuff that we get with the main title. So, for instance, Future Quest characters don't appear in any of the backup materials in these 4 issues.
Right. And for those, we've got Top Cat, the Jetsons, Rough and Ready,
and Snagglepuss.
Snagglepuss, yeah.
Right.
And honestly, I found those backup stories to be the bigger draw in these books than the main stories?
Sometimes I think that was the case for me. Not every time.
Okay.
But I agree. I do think that there's something about those short backup pieces that made these, at least for me, as a comics reader, feel that I needed to read these. Now, my position on the DC Hanna-Barbera things is that I do not keep up with the Hanna-Barbera titles that DC has now out right now. And I think you've mentioned having read several issues of the Flintstones and then Future Quest. And I have not been doing that. And the other Hanna-Barbera properties that DC is putting out, like Scooby-Doo, I haven't been reading either, right? Or the Wacky Races. And so I think it's interesting looking at these 4 annuals in that you are much more familiar with these titles or what DC's doing with the Hanna-Barbera properties lately than I am. I come to this knowing that they existed but not having read them. And I was wondering if each of these 4 issues is an annual in spirit and not just in title, I should be able to read them by themselves without having read anything else surrounding either the Hanna-Barbera properties or the DC properties like Suicide Squad or Green Lantern.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because that, I guess, where I would like to start with that particular issue then is with the Adam Strange Future Quest book.
Okay.
Because I think that's a book that does not stand on its own. It requires some knowledge of both the Future Quest series, and it takes place after issue number 12, which hasn't come out yet, and the recent Death of Hawkman series that Adam Strange appeared in that I didn't read. But I pick up from things like, the fact that Adam Strange thinks, for example, that Birdman is Hawkman.
Is Hawkman, yeah, because if you didn't know about the Hawkman situation, you'd wonder, why is this a point that he's making clear? Yeah,
exactly. So anyway, I still enjoyed that one, and part of the reason why I enjoy the Future Quest series in general, which is that it is, it's got some solid nostalgia elements to it, and this time we get not just Johnny Quest and his family, but also Dino Boy. And the aforementioned Birdman. So several of the Hanna-Barbera characters that are a part of Future Quest show up here, and those are fun. I'm not super familiar though with the with what the current state of Adam Strange is. And Adam Strange is a character I used to like a lot. But I know he showed up in Justice League Unlimited that Jeff Lemire wrote, and I only read a few issues of that. So, like I said, didn't read the Death of Hawkman series, so I'm not sure what was going on. I'm not sure of everything that's going on there, though I feel like I do have a handle on it. If the book's called Death of Hawkman, I think I would hope that it lives up to that billing, and so I'm guessing Hawkman's dead.
Well, a couple things you've pointed out just kind of strike me as interesting. You mentioned the nostalgic effect, and this is not a spoiler by any means, but I really love the way that this issue, Adam Strange and Future Quest special, ends, because there is like a funny moment with Bandit, which is exactly how the cartoon used to end. Right, where Bandit would do something that was cute, or it's like, oh, that wacky dog, and that's how this issue ends. And so when I saw that, I was getting the cartoon vibe, when I was a kid watching that cartoon throughout, but I think it really hit me when I got to the very end of that story. Now, the other thing you pointed out is this, of the 4 Hanna-Barbera annuals, is the one that seems to need the worlds of maybe Adam Strange, but definitely of what DC's been doing lately with Future Quest, in order to understand what's going on. I think to some degree, and you mentioned that issue 12 of Future Quest on the third page of story, I think it is, we do get a note from the editor that this story takes place 2 months after the events of Future Quest number 12. Right. Okay, so that's good. So at least they did that. I appreciate that. I mean, that's something that you actually don't find in comics near enough anymore, those kind of editorial intrusions. And you would find it all the time in, let's say, the classic Marvel. We just don't get them near as frequently today, I don't think. I found that useful and not obtrusive. And I think there's one other place somewhere in this issue where there is an editorial commentary to give some kind of context.
Right.
But, outside of that, without having read any Future Quest comics, and I haven't, I could get into this fairly well. I did sense that, yes, if I had read some earlier Future Quest comics, I may appreciate this more. But nonetheless, I do think that from where I'm sitting as a newbie here, this annual kind of stands on its own.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because honestly, it felt to me more like a 13th issue of Future Quest.
Okay.
But it does also let us know, for example, that after Future Quest, the issue of the vortexes that are the main kind of plot point of that other series remain, and the issue 12 of Future Quest was billed as the final issue, but Jeff Parker has gone on social media to say that that's just the end of season 1 or whatever, that there'll be more Future Quest later. And I really do hope that's the case, because it's also happened with this this month, or the recently solicited issue 12 of Flintstones, I think, is being solicited as the last issue of that series as well.
Now, again, I did feel that the Adam Strange Future Quest annual was something ongoing. Again, there was a story around it, and I'm kind of just catching up here. But I do think that the writers do a pretty good job of not leaving newbies out in the cold, people who aren't familiar with Future Quest. But, I mean, it does have more of a continuation feel to it. Whereas I think the other issues, Suicide Squad Banana Splits, Green Lantern Space Ghost, and Booster Gold The Flintstones, those definitely stand on their own. I mean, I don't read the Flintstones either, but I just got the sense that there was nothing about this Booster Gold Flintstones issue that is directly and even necessarily linked to either what DC's doing with the Flintstones or anything previous from Booster Gold. Right.
Now, in the Future Quest Adam Strange issue, the backup story for that is Top Cat. Written by Dan Didio with art by Phil Winslade. And it's basically kind of Top Cat teaming up with Batman, sort of.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, with Catwoman featured as well.
Yeah.
And so, but basically it's more or less the origin of Top Cat and how he happens to get into the DC, how he happens to make his way into the DC universe.
Yeah. And, with all of these Hanna-Barbera backup stories, maybe with a minor exception of the one... no. Okay, if we just stick with the backup stories, one of the things I really appreciate about these is that the artists have tried to render these cartoon characters in a more... I mean, they're definitely cartoonish, but there's more detailed in realism to them as a cartoon. So, for instance, we get some kind of realistic, almost three-dimensionality when it comes to Winslade's rendering of Top Cat. And I think we get the same thing with Howard Porter's Snagglepuss, Howard Chaykin's Rough and Ready, and then, Pierre Brito's The Jetsons. So... I do like that, and in fact, the art with the backup stories seems, to me at least, to be more detailed and quote unquote realistic than in the main title stories themselves.
Yeah, I think Well, I think in this Adam Strange and Future Quest ones, having Steve Lieber do the art was a great idea because his art's pretty consistent with the art styles that were used in Future Quest, like Doc Shaner being one of the main artists, but also Steve Rude and no, I'm drawing a blank. Is it Jan Duursema, maybe? Jan Duursema? I can't remember. Anyway, so that kind of clean line style is consistent, at least with that series. But you're right. What it would look like if Top Cat existed in Gotham City with Batman, and you get that you do get that that feel to it,
right?
Did you watch Top Cat as a kid?
Oh yeah, I mean all of these, with the exception of Rough and Ready, I watched as a kid, and I'm sure I saw some older episodes of Rough and Ready. But Rough and Ready was of all of these Hanna-Barbera properties, I think the earliest, because that began in the late 1950s.
Yeah, I have some Rough and Ready comics that Dell put out, but I don't think I've ever seen a Rough and Ready cartoon as far as I know. And so I thought that was an interesting addition, because I don't know if there's a large amount of there's as much Rough and Ready nostalgia as there is for Johnny Quest or something like that.
Right. Yeah, or the Jetsons maybe. Yeah.
Or the Jetsons, yeah. I figured out early on enough that Top Cat was supposed to be Sergeant Bilko when I was a kid. So that Flintstones were the honeymooners.
Right.
Jetsons was like
well, it's a futuristic Flintstones.
Yeah, but I always thought the Jetsons was something more like the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah. In fact, I felt the same thing with Top Cat as a kid, because I don't know if I was able to see Bilko outside of something that we had in Charlotte when I was growing up on Friday nights. It was called Those Were the Years, and it was a local production. So basically you had, I think it was one of the local weathermen there at WBTV would, Mike McKay, I think that's his name, if I remember correctly, and he would host this show on Saturday nights, I guess around 11:30 after the news, and then for maybe 2 hours, maybe more, I can't recall, show old shows from the 1950s and 60s. And Bilko was one of those. And so that's how I learned about not only Sergeant Bilko, but also Phil Silvers. And I even as a kid, I could immediately put that to Top Cat.
Yeah. Well, I had, I was, lived at least, my first 7 or 8 years in New Jersey, so I could get the New York stations like WPIX and so on that did show that were, pretty much all reruns. And so I watched a lot of the Phil Silvers show on one of those channels when I was a kid. And
you could tell that Top Cat was.
Oh yeah. But yeah, so we get a kind of, I don't know. One of the interesting things I find about this Top Cat story too is that it's a good example of having a voiceover narration that doesn't match with what we're seeing in the pictures.
Right.
Because Top Cat's telling Batman his story, and he's telling a much more kind of positive and sanitized version of his story than what actually, was going on with Top Cat's life. And so,
and we get, without giving anything away, we get, I mean, that point is driven home on the very last page of this strip, which kind of turns a number of things, right? It turns Top Cat's relationship with Batman, but it also turns our sense of who Top Cat is as compared to how Top Cat represents himself and his story to Batman. Yeah.
Yeah, and each of these backup stories ends with to be continued, or an indication that the story is going to continue in another book. So this is claiming we're going to get more Top Cat.
Right. Now, I noticed that maybe not all of these shorts end with a to be continued, but I think maybe at least half, if not most of them do. So Top Cat definitely does. I can't remember, and we can look at some of these others. In fact, we may want to look at some of these other titles. We did mention that Steve Lieber was the artist of the Adam Strange Future Quest, but I don't think we mentioned the writers, and that's Mark Andreyko and Jeff Parker. They wrote the Adam Strange Future Quest title.
Yeah, and they both and Andreyko wrote The Death of Hawkman, and Parker wrote Future Quest. So that makes sense that they're
doing that together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, of the other three, which do you want to turn to next?
I don't know. We can go. I got them in alphabetical order. So Booster Gold and Flintstones.
Okay, yeah. Now, with Booster Gold and Flintstones, and the backup story with this one is the Jetsons. So Mark Russell does the writing of the story proper, and then Rick Leonardi and Scott Hanna do the art. Now, with the Jetsons short, that's Jim Palmiotti and Amanda Connor with the writing, and Pierre Brito with the art. I'm not a big fan of Booster Gold. I like him well enough, and I think that he's handled best when he's not taken too seriously, as, the character shouldn't be taken too seriously.
Right.
And I think that works out very well in this story. I consider this maybe, I was going to say kind of a typical Booster Gold story in many ways. In another way, it is a primarily Booster Gold story. It just seems to me that the Flintstones are taking back, if not third row seats in this main story. What do you think?
Yeah, that could be. I really like Mark Russell's writing. I find Mark Russell's writing to be really smart and hilarious. I especially really like the sequence in which he is Booster Gold is kind of seeking out the other time travelers to get their help. And and bad things keep happening to him, like Dr. Clocker, who's clearly supposed to be Doctor Who, is in
Vesuvius.
Mount Vesuvius, and so he gets killed, and then the third time traveler is Crabulon of Omega 6, who's standing in line for a Who concert, which I'm guessing is Cincinnati. That's kind of poor taste, but nonetheless appreciated. So there's who is this book aimed at, if that's the joke? That goes almost completely unexplained. So basically Booster Gold can't get a hold of any reliable time travelers because they're all at a place where they're about to get killed, or get killed.
Yeah. Now, I know that you're not a very big Doctor Who fan, but there was actually an episode where Doctor Who does go to Pompeii on the eve of the volcano eruption. Yeah, and in fact, it was the first appearance in a Doctor Who of Peter Capaldi before Peter Capaldi was the new Doctor. Ah,
okay.
So for those Doctor Who fans, those Whovians out there, we have scratched your itch on this episode.
Yeah, I feel like I'm glad you mentioned that. It would have been remiss if we didn't make that reference.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you're right though that this seems to be more of a Booster Gold story than it is a Flintstone story, but I actually feel like this one's probably my favorite of the four.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if it's my favorite, but I definitely like it. And one of the things I appreciated about this is, and again, I have not read the Flintstones series, so I'm going by what you tell me and what I've heard from others who've read this as well, is that what they do is that Mark Russell isn't afraid of taking on very contemporary issues, maybe not like in the moment in terms of a political issue or social issue that's going on, but maybe even larger issues that's very pertinent now, without being overt about it. Like, so for instance, you were telling me about, or I guess early in the series, that Barney and Fred and they were ostracized because they were monogamous, which is not what the norm was at the time, and so they weren't understood because they were doing something different when it came to sexuality and relationships.
Yeah, they were going against traditional marriage.
Right, exactly. And so there's something traditional at the time, and there's something about that going on here, right? Because when this prophet from another world named Gorak, how he interacts with the world and what he tells people about them misinterpreting him. I mean, you know where this is going, and I mean, I really appreciated that.
Yeah, that was. I thought that was pretty funny.
And quite timely.
Yeah.
When it comes to religious unrest, war, and all that, and intolerance. But yeah, I liked the Booster Gold Flintstone issue. The Jetsons backup, it was okay. It didn't bowl me over like some of the others did, but I thought that the punchline was pretty good.
Yeah, it is. Of all of them, though, it does seem to be taking the property the most seriously.
Right.
I don't know if it's all that funny. Except for what you mentioned with the punchline, but it is just basically, a family in the future.
Right. And this is another one of those that in the very last panel it says to be continued in the Jetsons. So there seems to be a pretty clear indication that there's going to be some new Hanna-Barbera titles. This maybe being one.
Yeah, and this month in previews there were all those Warner Brothers DC crossovers, like what was it, like Jonah Hex and Yosemite Sam or something like that. Bugs Bunny and the Legion of Superheroes. So it does seem like this sort of crossover thing is something that DC is interested in pursuing more too.
Yeah, and I think if they do it well, it'll be fun. For instance, I mean, I found all 4 of these issues to be enjoyable reads. And, there may be one, and we'll get to it eventually, that is not my favorite, but I think it's still okay. But what they're doing here, I don't think that they're forcing anything. And that's always the danger when you cross over properties. Or when you start inserting things in one universe that is really not necessarily a part of that universe. And so, bringing together Hanna-Barbera characters with DC heroes, on the surface, it has the potential for hokiness, but I don't think it's dealt with as hokey at all in any of these issues.
No. I don't know if we're done with the one we just read or just talked about, but the one that I found the most, I guess, disappointing as far as being a missed opportunity, though, was Green Lantern and Space Ghost.
Okay.
Probably
so how did you see this as a lost opportunity? Well,
probably because both Green Lantern and Space Ghost are 2 characters I really enjoy a lot. I kind of wish that the story hadn't bothered dealing with like Larfleeze, for example. I wish that they could have a Green Lantern story that didn't have to involve all these other goddamn other goddamn colored lanterns.
Yeah.
Because basically the idea that both Green Lantern and Space Ghost are basically space cops for different organizations, I thought would have been a great hook on its own, and that's what most of the story does end up being.
Right.
I think Ariel Olafetti's drawing of both Space Ghost and Green Lantern is great too.
Oh yeah.
I do wish he hadn't used photorealistic backgrounds, however.
Yeah, that does throw you a tad.
Yeah. Especially because his art style doesn't quite line up with it.
Right.
So these kind of computer generated photorealistic backgrounds I don't think work.
Yeah, his drawing of the characters almost, but not quite, fits in with the photorealistic backgrounds. But there's just enough off kilter there to make you pay attention to it. In other words, to bring you out of the story momentarily. So now you mentioned Olivetti did the art. On this one, James Tynion IV and Christopher Sabella do the writing.
Right.
And I'm with you on this story, liking it except for the Larfleeze. I said a moment ago that for the most part they really don't force anything. It's the Larfleeze here that seems to be the most forced among all the four titles that we're discussing. I wish they could have left Larfleeze out. I mean, on his own and within the context of the Green Lantern world, okay, yeah, he's fine. Sometimes it's a comic relief. Annoying, but okay. Was he needed here? Definitely not. And so if you extract the Larfleeze parts, those panels, from the story, you lose nothing.
All right.
In fact, you gain, if anything.
Yeah. One of the things I meant to by a missed opportunity is, for example, that I think that there's a really cool moment later in the story where Green Lantern and Space Ghost trade weapons. It's a little forced as to how they end up with each other's weapons. And it only lasts 2 pages before they trade back. I felt like that alone there was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, they could definitely have done more with that. And I wish they had. And in fact, flipping to those pages that you were mentioning, I came upon something that I'd actually forgotten. And this is another element in the Green Lantern Space Ghost Annual that I think approaches forced dumb. And that is one part where Green Lantern uses the ring to create a frightening image, and it's Batman.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, can't we get through any DC comic without a reference, even indirectly, to Batman and his universe? But even though there were, as you put it, missed opportunities here, and I think gratuitous moments where they've just injected parts of the DC universe that they didn't need to, I thought it was a pretty good story.
Yeah. I mean, it works. I would, again, I think, I guess maybe part of my feeling about it could have had something to do with that being probably the one I was looking forward to the most.
Oh, okay.
Too, but yeah, I don't know. I'd like to see somebody else take a shot at that.
Yeah,
team up again, because it's the most of all these two. It seems like it's the most logical,
right? The most natural. Now, of these 4 Hanna-Barbera annuals, there are only 2 that have currently ongoing Hanna-Barbera storylines, and that's Future Quest and the Flintstones. But the Space Ghost, we don't. I mean, DC did a Space Ghost miniseries back in 2004, but not since, and definitely not currently. Same thing with the Banana Splits. So, I mean, Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Space Ghost is in Future Quest.
Oh, okay, but he's a part of the Future Quest, right? But he's I remember he was a part of that, I guess, in the initial issues. Is continuing to be a part of.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so he is, but the Banana Splits are not, correct?
Oh no.
Okay, so I guess correct what I was about to say. I guess it's the Banana Splits that's the only Hanna-Barbera property dealt with these in these annuals that we don't have anything going on right now. But what did you think of the Chaykin Rough and Ready?
Well, if
the laugh is the answer, right?
Yeah, if there was going to be a if you were to imagine what a Chaykin Rough and Ready comic would be like, you're probably pretty close to this. That basically Rough and Ready, who are a cat and a dog, are stand-up comics in the kind of heyday of stand-up comedy and early television. So this could have easily taken place within Satellite Sam universe.
Right.
And so let's see. So they start out with now what is Ruff and
Ruff is the cat and Reddy is the dog.
Yeah, but Ruff starts out with a mouse as his partner.
Oh, yeah.
And that's Ruff and Tumble. And then Reddy has a partner. I'm forgetting what that is. That is a parrot, right?
Right.
Yeah. So but
Reddy can't
human,
deliver.
Right. It's Reddy, Willing, and Able.
Yeah.
Are the three the trio? But Reddy can't deliver it, and then so Ruff loses his partner Tumble. Reddy gets fired. Ruff ends up doing an act with a human female called Rough Sex. And with a joke of what happens if your donkey eats my rooster, the punchline of which is bleeped, and with the footnote saying, next time you see me at a show, get this book signed and I'll tell you the punchline. I think we already know.
Right.
I think we can know. I can extrapolate from the joke what it is.
Right.
And then Reddy, it becomes like a
solo stand-up artist.
Yeah, solo stand-up comic, but like in the what's his name? Like, he's also doing kind of edgy sexual comedy.
Right.
And then the two of them, then Ruff and Reddy end up teaming up when they discover an act that has stolen their material.
Right. And then because each of them has material stolen and they take revenge together, then they say, hey, why don't we team up?
Yeah.
And the way that this one ends, the other ones that we mentioned, the to be continued, right? Now, this one doesn't say to be continued, but it says, stay tuned, damn it, in that last panel. And this is Howard Chaykin talking, because it's a yellow panel. And earlier, you mentioned, get this book signed next time you see me and I'll tell you the punchline. He signed that. So it's him saying, stay tuned, damn it. Does that mean there's going to be a Rough and Ready, maybe Chaykin penned comic? I hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a lot of fun, and the idea of Chaykin being able to explore these early days of stand-up comedy in the overlapping with the golden age of television, and the stuff that people could say on television versus what they were doing in their stand-up acts, I think would be, would have a lot of potential. So right. I would read it.
Yeah, I would too. I like all four of these backup features, but the one that I probably enjoyed the most, and maybe even appreciate the most, has to be this one from Chaykin.
Yeah, when I heard that he was doing it, I thought, oh, he's going to be doing Rough and Ready as like Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis,
right? And
it's not quite that.
No.
So it goes a little bit. It changed my expectations a little bit, but I do like. I mean, I'm a sucker for that. The history of comedy in that era, anyway. I mean, we talk about the Gilbert Gottfried podcast a lot, and they get into that.
Oh yeah,
that time all the time on that show. So it's fun to see this explored in a DC comic as well.
Yeah. So if Chaykin can take what he and Matt Fraction were doing with Satellite Sam and translate that into the Hanna-Barbera world to make, a kid's cartoon very edgy, I'm on board.
Right. Yeah. Well, why you always see walruses at Tupperware parties?
And we get the punchline for that one.
Yeah, we do get the punchline for that one.
Okay, well, we should tell you want to tell our listeners what the punchline is, or should
they always like a tight seal.
Yeah.
Man,
You got to love this.
Yep.
Do you want to move on to the fourth one, Suicide Squad and the Banana Splits?
Yep.
Yeah. You were saying that of the four that came out, the one that disappointed you the most was the Green Lantern Space Ghost because it was a missed opportunity. You were expecting more. For me, it's the Suicide Squad Banana Splits that disappointed me. Not so much because of the Suicide Squad and what they could do, but definitely because of the Banana Splits. Because as a kid, I absolutely loved the Banana Splits. I will watch now if the Banana Splits is on TV and I'm flipping channels. I'll watch it. I'll stop and just watch it at the expense of anything else I maybe want to watch. And so I was really wanting something good to come out of this annual. I don't think it's bad. I mean, I enjoyed it well enough. It's just of the four, it's the one that didn't resonate the most with me.
Well, I think this is the one for me, and it's written by Tony Bedard with art by Ben Caldwell and Mark Morales. I like the hook of this one, the idea that that the Banana Splits end up getting arrested and they're in jail, and the Suicide Squad is in trouble, and so Amanda Waller needs some new recruits who are completely and totally expendable, and so she gets the Banana Splits to go in and rescue the Suicide Squad. Because
they had been arrested recently.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty clever hook, and so then you get to see the Banana Splits shoot guns, kill people. Those are things I always wanted to see.
See the Banana Splits kill people.
Yeah, and then the way the Banana Splits update their act at the end, I think is pretty good too.
Okay, see, that was the part that I think was the disappointment for me, because I think that, I mean, on the one hand, I can see the attraction to that, but I think that was too easy, or for me at least, too expected of an ending. Because when I first started reading this, and they made reference the first time, because they do several times in this issue, that they play music, and when someone asks them what kind of music, it's like bubblegum pop music, and say, what is that, or why do you do that? And that's what the Banana Splits were about. And I knew from that first moment that they mentioned the kind of music that they played, I said, I wonder if by the very end they'll change their style to something that is much more rap influenced. And so to me, it was expected. It was a little predictable. I would have respected, I think, the ending more if they had stuck to their bubblegum stuff.
I see.
And tried to make it more hip. And I think that's where my disappointment came. Now, I like the Suicide Squad well enough, but I'm not a fan of the Suicide Squad. But I can say that with all these other characters from DC that we've been discussing, like Adam Strange, Green Lantern, Booster Gold, I enjoy. I will go many times out of my way, depending, to read some of their comics. Suicide Squad, really not so much. I mean, I appreciate what they do. It's just they've never been my favorite. And so I think that may feed into my slight disappointment as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because I have a lot of fondness for the John Ostrander and Luke McDonnell Suicide Run comics, or Suicide Squad, comics that came out in the 80s. I have zero interest in the current lineup of the Suicide Squad. I don't think there's a character in there that I care enough about to want to read a comic that they're in. And it's basically the movie lineup pretty much right now, which I didn't see. So I could give or take whoever's in here with the Suicide Squad. But I did like this. I did like this concept.
Yeah. Now, I did like the personalities that Bedard and Caldwell were able, or Bedard and was able to bring out here. Because we did get to see the four Banana Splits. And I mean, they were easily enough distinguished one from the other in the TV series, but I think now we get to see more of their personalities in this comic, and that is one thing I enjoyed about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what I liked even more in this annual than the Suicide Squad Banana Split story is the backup feature on Snagglepuss.
Yes.
By Mark Russell and Howard Porter.
Yeah, I think the idea of Snagglepuss basically being like a Tennessee Williams style Southern playwright is brilliant. And the fact that it does end with the adventure continues in Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles, I'm really happy to see.
Yeah, so there are definite plans for Snagglepuss comic?
I mean, that's what it says at the end. So
yeah. Well,
I'm assuming that's real.
Yeah, I mean, because I read that and I wondered, is it real though? I mean, it sounds like something that could be. On the other hand, it sounds like something melodramatic that would work with this character Snagglepuss, a la Tennessee Williams.
Sure, yeah.
But I mean, I would hope so. I like the story, but I think the standout of this backups part in this issue is Howard Porter's art. And it reminded me, I mentioned earlier about the almost three-dimensionality of Winslade's Top Cat. You have something similar going on here, highly detailed. I mean, there really is quite a bit of depth, visual depth, that they're bringing to these, arguably two-dimensional animation figures from Hanna-Barbera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you see how these, these anthropomorphic figures are interacting with humans. I know, what is it in the Howard Chaykin one, he refers to it as celimate, CELIMATE, for the cartoon characters living in the real world,
the human world,
or in the human world.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that comes from somewhere else or if that's just a term that he came up with, or if that is part of this whole Hanna-Barbera development, at DC, or line at DC.
It would be good if they're planning for them to do that, if they're planning on coming out with some of these comics, because I would like to see more of this, because in the Snagglepuss feature, not only do we get Snagglepuss, but we also get Augie Doggy.
Right.
And
who's an aspiring writer.
Yeah, Solon's Doggy Daddy.
Yeah. Yeah. But and then so Snagglepuss is testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and is being kind of his flamboyant self, and then he tells Augie Doggy basically his origin story. So it has a similar structure to some of the others, like the Top Cat one. Mm-hmm. And and the tragedy of his origin story is hilarious.
Yeah.
So I think it's a brilliant idea, first of all, because of Snagglepuss's whole tagline being exit stage left or exit stage right.
Exit stage left.
and whatever is it, and on fire even, or whatever. So his little catchphrases and ways of speaking, I think, fit perfectly with this. I could hear his voice. I think Mark Russell did a really good job of making it sound like the Snagglepuss. You could hear this in Snagglepuss's voice very easily.
Yeah, and I think that all of the writers of these backup features, but I guess that all the writers of the Hanna-Barbera parts of any of these annuals do a pretty good job of capturing the voice of the original animation fairly well. And here I want to mention that, and this is in no way the fault of either Tinian and Sabella or just Space Ghost as a character, but I cannot see or read anything dealing with, let's say, the original Space Ghost without thinking of Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And as much as I loved that, it's ruined my appreciation of the original Space Ghost. And so when I see Space Ghost or Zorak or oh God, who's the Brack? Yeah, Brack.
Yeah.
I can't help but think of those parodic cartoons.
That's funny you say that, because at the beginning of that Space Ghost story, there's an attack from like Zorak's fleet, and I had to make a little bit of an adjustment. Like, wait, isn't Zorak the Space Ghost band leader?
Yeah. And, I think it would have been worse had they mentioned Brack, because Brack for a while on Adult Swim had his own series, which is hilarious. And so he comes across as even more ridiculous. But he was originally one of these alien antagonists to Space Ghost, just as Zorak was.
Right. Yeah, I love the Brack show.
Yeah. I got to go back and watch some of those old episodes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I have a bunch of the songs on somewhere around here.
Oh, yeah. I have a lot of those. There were several CDs that they came out with, like the Space Ghost stuff, and then Brack, and then Adult Swim as well. Yeah. And I remember one year, my family went down to the North Carolina beaches for a week, and we went with my mother-in-law, and it was her very first time at the beach. And the kids were young enough to where they were still getting really excited with certain cartoons, and they loved Space Ghost and especially Brack. And they must have listened all week long to, I think, 2 Space Ghost CDs multiple times, to the point that my mother-in-law was threatening them if they played it again. It is hilarious stuff.
I'm trying to remember what the songs were that I listened to over and over again, and now I can't remember.
You mean from the Adult Swim stuff?
From the Brack show.
From the Brack show?
I get, yeah. Oh, well, I'll remember someday.
An interesting subtitle for this week's episode would be something like Reminiscing or Memory Lane or something to that effect.
But what you're talking about too there is interesting, because when I was a kid, well, there weren't a lot of Space Ghost comic books. I had Space Ghost Big Little book, which I read to pieces. I read that over and over again, and I watched the cartoon every chance I got. But it was in reruns by the time, because it had already come and gone. So I think I'm at the tail end of the generation that would be nostalgic for Space Ghost in its original form.
Right.
And then there's a whole nother generation, that, and I think this is a big kind of Generation X thing, especially, to be a bit nostalgic for then Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which I think then bleeds into your kids' generation as well.
Right. Now, you were talking about older instances of Space Ghost in comics. I looked this up, and at least on mycomicshop.com, and searched for Space Ghost. And, there's the aforementioned 6-issue miniseries from DC in 2004, but there's also the Gold Key Space Ghost, which I think you mentioned. Comico did an issue of Space Ghost in 1987, and then in 1997, Archie did, I think, a single issue of Cartoon Network Space Ghost.
And that wasn't, I think that the Archie one was closer to Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Okay.
Because it also features Dino Boy in that same issue on the cover.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'm thinking of something else. Because I think there was a Cartoon Network series that DC did that did have Space Ghost Coast to Coast in it. I may be thinking of a DC one.
The Cartoon Network. Okay, I'm sorry. The Cartoon Network did do a single issue, I see here, of Space Ghost Coast to Coast giveaway.
Yeah. Okay, so I remember that. But the Comico one is great. I still have that. It was written by Mark Evanier and drawn by Steve Rude, and Steve Rude was so heavily influenced by that series in with his art in Nexus. There were, in fact, in Nexus, you would often see in the background, Rude would draw Space Ghost or Jan and Jace, or Blip the monkey.
Blip.
Yeah, that's another thing too that might be a little bit of a missed opportunity, is that Jan, Jace, and Blip aren't in that Green Lantern Space Ghost book.
But Dan Larfleet says.
But other than that, there was only one Space Ghost comic contemporaneous with the TV series, with the original TV series, which seems weird to me, but I think a lot of that Hanna-Barbera stuff didn't have corresponding comic books at the time.
Wow. Most of what we've discussed this week has me wanting to go back and seek out these older cartoons from Hanna-Barbera. So it is, in many ways, kind of a trip down memory lane. In fact, the one title that we looked at that is not nostalgic, I guess in ways that are tangible, is where we started, and that was Michael DeForge's Styx Angelica folk hero that came out recently from Drawn and Quarterly. But then we looked at the 4 DC Hanna-Barbera annuals, Adam Strange, Future Quest, Booster Gold, The Flintstones, Green Lantern, Space Ghost, and Suicide Squad, The Banana Splits. So I'm glad we looked at those. And so this, we do say on the Comics Alternative, we don't look at mainstream superheroes. But as we said on our very first episode, there are occasions where we will engage with not just the superhero genre, but also maybe even mainstream superheroes if they look at it in a critical or parodic or, in largely twisted, unconventional manner.
Yeah, and I think that that DC is doing some interesting things with these Hanna-Barbera properties that I feel like is worth exploring here. And from the looks of these annuals, there's going to be more of this stuff coming up.
Yep. And if there are new series coming out from DC with the Hanna-Barbera line, you can find great discounts on these titles at our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. You can also find, as Andy pointed out at the top of the show, a great discount on Styx Angelica Folk Hero. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a slew of specials. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com, and you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed that you can check out, the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get hold of us, let us know how we're doing and find out what we're doing.
That's right. And we do like to hear from you. So get in touch. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.